Well, yeah, let's dive into our topic for today, which is continuing our discussion of eugenics in the modern kind of era, post-World War II. And just as a kind of opening devotion, I want to focus on the Bible and children. Eugenics is very much concerned about children and their genetic quality and their superior traits and things like this. So what does the Bible say about children? Well, I was reading through Genesis 33 one time, and it struck me something that Jacob said about his children. And this is an episode from the biblical patriarch Jacob's life. Remember Jacob, who is the father of Israel, right? He has the 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob had a twin brother, Esau, who earlier in his life he was alienated from because, remember, there was the whole thing about Jacob stole the birthright from Esau, and then he also stole the deathbed blessing of his father Isaac from Esau. Yeah, Alan.
He took what did you call that from his brother?
The birthright.
Birthright, because they were twins, right?
Yeah, and Esau was technically the older. It was who was born first, and Esau was born first. Yeah, and these things, they had greater significance, but we understand inheritance today, and so if you stole someone's inheritance, they would rightly be mad at you. So Jacob and Esau, after years of separation, right? Jacob he got married, had a family. His children are growing. So this was after years of separation, where Jacob fled from Esau. They're coming back together, and it's kind of this tense moment in Scripture because Jacob is sending out his flocks and his servants before him, and then his family, some of his family for him, and then he keeps his favorite son at the back of the line, because he's encountering Esau for the first time. He doesn't know how Esau is going to receive him. And it turns out that Esau is graciously going to receive him, and he forgives him, and they reunite as brothers. So it's this beautiful scene of reconciliation in the Bible. But I want to focus on verse 5 of when they meet, Jacob and Esau. And this is chapter 33, verse 5 of Genesis. And when Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, he said, "Who are these with you?" Jacob said, "The children whom God has graciously given your servant." And there's many other things going on in this story, but what I wanted to focus on is Jacob's response. He says, "These are the children whom God has graciously given your servant." And so from Jacob's response, we see it is God who gives us our children graciously as a gift. And this is not just an isolated incident. This is not just Jacob's opinion. This is all over the Scripture, as you see there. Just for the sake of time, we won't look up all these passages, but repeatedly throughout the Bible, children are referred to as a blessing, a gift, and a reward from God. And so often in our modern society, this contradicts what we hear about children. You don't often hear the message that children are a gift from God. And certainly the eugenicist message was, well, maybe they're a gift if they're genetically fit enough. But the Bible has no such distinction in the gifts that God gives to us in our children. Children are a gift, period. There's none of this eugenic business in the Bible. And so I say, from this, eugenics appears to be a man-made good work. This is something we're always doing in our sinful condition. We're always trying to self-justify, have a reason for being declared right with God by our own good works. So eugenics just appears to be another project of self-justification. Now, they frame it in terms of the language of evolution, Darwinian evolution, and having a superior race, having a superior species, and things like this. But nonetheless, it's still an effort at self-justification. We're going to become genetically good enough or genetically even perfect. This is this notion of salvation in eugenics. So eugenics appears to be a man-made good work to justify oneself before God. And I was reading in the large catechism on the Fourth Commandment, and this is what Dr. Luther has to say about man-made good works. He says, "For what God commands must be much better and far nobler than everything we can come up with ourselves." And so that's really a summary of I guess you'd say, a summary of the futility of our own good works. The good works that we invent, that we hold up to God, to say, okay, God, you can praise me now for doing these good works, that we self-invent, these are nothing. These are worthless compared to just the simple things that God commands us. So, for example, in the Fourth Commandment, God tells us to honor our father and mother. So honoring our father and mother is a much greater and far more good work than anything we could ever come up with. And this whole eugenic project is a man-made good work that seeks to say that some children are not a gift and blessing from God. And so the whole eugenic enterprise is a worthless, self-made work that God has nowhere commanded us to pursue. But instead we have the witness of Scripture that children are a gift, blessing, and reward from God. So just something to ponder as we get back into this whole discussion of eugenics this week. Any questions there? Comments?
Can you just tell me what you meant by justification before God by the eugenics? How does that justify ourselves?
So how is eugenics a project of self-justification?
Yeah.
It is a project of self-justification in as much as we're trying to better ourselves and improve ourselves to somehow meet a certain level or a certain quality or a certain criteria of human goodness. It's this whole notion that humanity is evolving and we're getting better and we're moving towards some goal of genetic perfection, and we're not quite there yet. So we need to do this effort to reach that goal. So in the eugenicist case, the self-justification is, they might not frame it in terms of being justified before God, but they are trying to justify themselves before the false gods of science, genetics, human achievement. We're all always trying to self-justify in one way or another. People might not frame it as in terms of they're trying to get right with God, but they are trying to get right with some sort of God, lowercase g, in their life. And we like I said, we're always trying to do this in our social interactions and in what we do. We're trying to make ourselves look better. The things we post on social media, if you're into that, we're always trying to make ourselves look better. It's all kind of in the endeavor of self-justification. And so I see eugenics in the same light. It's just they would frame it in terms of science, evolution, genetics, things like this.
So justification then meaning I'm not good enough and I've got to do something to get better.
Yep, exactly. So the goal is over here, and I'm not quite there yet, so my own effort is going to get me there. Right, and that's exactly the opposite from how God justifies us, right? Yeah, we are inadequate by ourselves, but it's not us who's going to fix that problem. Alan?
Do you think the success of America from 1945 to 1965 with improvements in everything, health, work, finances. Therefore, time promotes this, help to promote this.
Yeah, the kind of the abundance and success of America has lent itself to eugenic thinking. Sure, I could see that. How do you mean?
Well, I just see a lot of things starting to just fall apart after 1963, 64, 65. I mean, common norms of honor your father and mother, just questioned till it has no meaning.
Well, yeah, I certainly think that questioning norms has certainly played a big part of, why are we supposed to have children? Children, at least in recent centuries, have been thought of as a gift. But now they're thought of more as a project, and we could get into that, but that's kind of a tangent. But yeah, I think that the breaking down of biblical norms has contributed to eugenic tendencies in childbearing and rearing. All right, so that kind of concludes my the devotional part of the beginning of our study here. So we'll get into eugenics proper here. So remember, in our previous sessions, we talked about the definition of eugenics by the early eugenicists themselves: the study of agencies under social control that may improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. And again, the language of racial qualities would be more understood today as genetic qualities. So eugenics is this task of improving the human race genetically, and to prevent the impairment of the race genetically as well. So both in terms of the positive and the negative task of eugenics, improving and seeking to discourage dysgenic or not the opposite of improvement of genetic quality. The reason I bring up this definition again is because, remember last time we spoke about eugenics after World War II did not disappear, but rather it kind of morphed. The whole eugenic task morphed, and there was still emphasis on eugenics, but the emphasis shifted from coercive eugenics to individual choice and consumer preference. And the reason I highlight this is from Philippa Levine's book, Eugenics, a very short introduction. The reason I focus on this shift in emphasis from coercion to individual choice is because, look at this definition again: the study of agencies under social control that may improve or impair future generations. Can that be done coercively? Well, yes, of course. That's what the whole forced sterilization business was about. But can this be done non-coercively as well? Sure. Yeah.
Improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations. So how would it be impair?
Well, you wouldn't. This is the whole notion of positive versus negative eugenics. Positive eugenics seeks to improve the genetic stock, if you will, whereas negative eugenics seeks to prevent the impairment of genetic quality in humankind. So you have the whole notion of positive and negative eugenics. Now, the negative eugenics, that's what came through really forcefully, but with like forced sterilization and stuff. But positive eugenics, that was more like, encourage genetically superior people to get married and have children. So there wasn't as much forceful implementation of positive eugenics as there was of negative eugenics, certainly, pre-World War II and the like. But the point I'm drawing out here is that this eugenic task you can do it in a non-coercive way, right? So the whole notion that we should be improving the human race genetically and such, you can do that in a coercive way or in a non-coercive way. And that's what I'm trying to draw out with this study today, is that eugenic goals can still be pursued in a non-coercive manner. And it is my kind of observation that the modern society, if it rejects eugenics at all, it rejects it based on its coercion. So we shouldn't be forcibly sterilizing people. We shouldn't be forcing people to have abortions, things like that, for disabled children. But if we let them choose to do that, then it's okay. The Christian has to go farther than that. And there's something wrong. You have this tree here. It's not just that the fruit of the tree is bitter and poisonous. The whole root of this tree, this eugenic tree, is bitter and poisonous. If in other words, if we just change the fruit from being a coercive eugenic to a non-coercive eugenics, that's not enough. That's not what God says in His Word about eugenics. He says more than just it shouldn't be coercive. Okay, so we have the shift from coercive to non-coercive eugenics would be the major shift after World War II. And is there any credence to this? So let's kind of dive in here. Remember, we spoke about how the eugenicists last time, they openly wrote about in their academic journals, at their conferences, in their organizations, how they wanted to continue to practice eugenics, but they even called it a crypto-eugenics, or a secret or hidden eugenics. Okay, so where does this cryptic eugenics or crypto-eugenics go after World War II? Well, eugenics went from being called eugenics to something you might have heard more of, population control and family planning. In fact, many of the population control organizations that sprung up after World War II were staffed by eugenicists, leaders in the eugenics community pre-World War II. So a great example of this is Frederick Osborne, who was the president of the American Eugenics Society. He went on to be the chair of the Population Council, which was interested in population control, started in 1952. So you have these old school eugenicists. They didn't just go away after the war. They started new organizations, like the Population Council. And this is a government document called the Kissinger Report. It was released in 1974. And in there's an explicit reference to this shift from coercive eugenics to personal choice or non-coercive eugenics. This report was a foreign relations report, and it was about distributing food aid, charitable aid, and development in kind of third world developing nations. And they said that specifically in this report, you must attach family planning policy to charitable aid that is given to foreign nations, especially developing nations, third world nations. So if you're going to give food and monetary assistance, it has to come along with a stipulation for this family planning, birth control, abortion, sterilization, things like this. All of these old kind of eugenic ideas, just now under a new name, family planning. And the Population Council actually hired a public relations firm to come up with a new name instead of family planning, or instead of eugenics and things like birth control. Those sound so coercive. They have this coercive kind of taboo and stereotype to them. So let's come up with something that sounds better. And they came up with family planning. And like I said, you're probably familiar with that term today. It's still popular today. And organizations like Planned Parenthood, it's all based on this whole notion of family planning. Alan, did you have a question?
Well, I guess you'll get to it. What's Mississippi appendectomy?
Okay, so the Kissinger report, it said that you do need to attach this family planning policy to charitable relief efforts, but it specifically said, avoid the appearance of coercion. Avoid the appearance of coercion. So again, it's this whole notion that coercion is bad. But the interesting thing is, it just says avoid the appearance of coercion. So crypto or hidden coercion is okay as long as you avoid the appearance of coercion. But there's this whole notion that coercion is bad, so we need to avoid the appearance of it. And yet, even after World War II, forced sterilizations were still happening. Remember, those sterilization laws were still on the books in many states. So they were still being used for eugenic purposes up into the 1970s and 1980s. And in some places, it was so common that it was euphemistically referred to as the appendectomy. Remember, a lot of times when people were sterilized, they were not informed that they were sterilized. And they might be told that they had an appendectomy. So Mississippi was one of the places where there's a famous court case regarding these sterilizations. And so these sterilizations came to be known as the Mississippi appendectomy. So even with, coercion, coercive eugenics had a bad name, but even after World War II, it was still happening coercively. It kind of had a slow burn or a slow die out. So like I said, population control and family planning kind of took on the mantle of the eugenic task after the war. The Population Council was established in 1952 to promote attitudes favorable to a small family norm. So now they kind of shifted in emphasis a little bit. Now it wasn't that there were too many unfit people, right? The whole eugenic task was to eliminate unfit people, whereas you were to promote the fit, the eugenically superior types. So the Population Council starts to shift the attitude towards now it's not that there's too many unfit people, it's just that there's too many people in general. This whole idea of overpopulation. However, buried within this, yes, there's too many people, but we could say in parenthesis, there's still too many unfit people as well. So they did the Population Council and other population groups like it, still push things like birth control and abortion in third world countries. Remember, the economically poor were classed as the group of unfit people that eugenicists were trying to eliminate. So these groups, pushed for eugenic practices in these countries. And at this time, after the war, abortion begins to be legalized in many places. As you know, in the United States, the famous Roe versus Wade Supreme Court case opened up that can of worms for our nation, abortion. What a lot of people don't realize is that birth control was also illegal in our nation until 1965. And there was a Supreme Court case there that made the distribution and sale and promotion of birth control legal in our country in 1965. Roe versus Wade comes in about 10 years later, 8 years later, and relies on the reasoning of that 1965 case for birth control to then also legalize abortion. So the two are tied together. And again, birth control was actually, Catholic or Protestant, was actually considered immoral for most of the history of the church until the 1900s. That's when we start to see a shift in thinking. And it wasn't until about the 1930s that birth control started to make inroads into some of the Protestant churches. And then finally, in 1965, the United States legalizes the use of birth control. But birth control and abortion were pushed in many third world countries, India, Singapore, China. You may have heard of China's one-child policy. You better believe that abortion plays a big role in that policy, right? Only one child per family. And in many cases, the legislation that pushed through these policies explicitly allowed for eugenic practices. So abortion was explicitly allowed for children with disabilities that were found to have disabilities. So what did Frederick Osborne have to say about all these developments? Remember, he was the president of the American Eugenics Society. And this is what he had to say about birth control and abortion. The American Eugenics Society name was changed because it became evident that changes of a eugenic nature would be made for reasons other than eugenics, and that tying a eugenic label to them would more often hinder than help their adoption. Birth control and abortion are turning out to be the great eugenic advances of our time. If they had been advanced for eugenic reasons, it would have retarded or stopped their acceptance. So there you have Frederick Osborne admitting that the reason that they changed their name from the American Eugenics Society to, or that they changed their name, the new name is escaping me now, but anyway, they changed their name because they understood that they could pursue eugenic goals in other areas than in eugenics proper. Now, is there any credence to this that birth control, abortion, and things like it are having a eugenic effect in our nation, like Frederick Osborne indicated? Well, yes, there is. In 1998, sociologist Dorothy Wertz was interested in this whole idea about eugenics and being pushed in genetic counseling. You may have heard of genetic counseling. The likelihood that you and your spouse would have a child with a genetic defect. That's basically what genetic counseling is about. She surveyed 3,000 genetics professionals in 36 different countries, and she asked them questions on ethical issues concerning eugenics, and she was basically asking them about eugenics without using that terminology. So she asked, are you supportive of mandatory sterilizations for basically people who are eugenically unfit? How would you counsel a couple with a fetus with a genetic condition, like Down syndrome, and things like this? And again, she did not use eugenic terminology whatsoever, just to see how they would respond. And this is what she found. There was an approval for parental choice. Again, so there's this whole support that, this whole idea that if eugenics is done on a personal, individual basis, then it's okay. So the support for parental choice. However, she also found a strong conviction for demonstrating social responsibility. Okay, so if you have a child who's going to be a burden to society, you have a social responsibility to take care of that child, whatever that means. She also found purposely slanted and openly directive counseling. And I encountered this with our first child when we were the first doctor we were going to see when Jenny was pregnant. And she specifically, this doctor was specifically funneling us towards getting the genetic test for Down syndrome and other genetic abnormalities. And we said, no, we're not going to do that. She said, yes, do it anyway. She wouldn't even, there was an element of coercion there, wasn't there? She wouldn't even let us say no. So we went to a different doctor at that point. But there was, I asked her, why is it important that we find out that our child has Down syndrome? And she said, well, some parents choose to abort at that point because of all the suffering that a Down syndrome child would cause. That's purposefully slanted counseling right there, especially the fact that we weren't even really given an option to refuse the test. I mean, we obviously refuse the test, but from the doctor's point of view, we were definitely being pressured into doing that. So I've seen this firsthand, I guess you could say. And just real quick, here's an anecdote of a nutritionist being fired from his job at the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. And just real quickly, as we're at the end of our time here, his name is James Hoffman. He was let go from his job as a nutritionist because he refused to refer his WIC clients, women, infants, and children clients, he refused to refer them on to genetic counseling if it was suspected that their child might have a genetic abnormality. And he was being pressured into doing this, especially if there was a high likelihood that the child would have a genetic abnormality. And he said, "It seems very inconsistent to me to treat the fetus like a baby when one is interested in feeding him or her, but to depersonify the fetus when the baby is unwanted or has a genetic defect." And there he was referring to how the mother of the child is actually more likely to feed the child well and better if the nutritionist personifies the baby. Sociological research has demonstrated that. And so he was saying, hey, if the child is healthy and well, then we should try and get the mother to eat well, but if we think it has a genetic abnormality, we should push her towards genetic counseling and the possibility of having an abortion. And his conscience could not stomach that, and he said he wouldn't do it, so they let him go. So much for non-coercive eugenics in the modern era. But that's where we'll have to end our study for today. Any questions or comments before we sign off? Well, it was a pleasure to dive into this with you today, and we will get back into this next week.